September 17, 1944. Over the Netherlands, the sky turns white. 1,400 transport aircraft and gliders. The largest airborne operation in history. 10,000 paratroopers jump in a single afternoon. It is, by any measure, one of the most spectacular military operations ever attempted. It is also built on a lie. 6 days before this drop, a young British intelligence officer walked into his commanding general's office. He had photographs, reconnaissance images taken from aircraft. They showed something that should have stopped the entire operation. 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, resting and rearming in the forests directly around Arnhem, right where 10,000 British paratroopers were about to land. The general looked at the photographs. He looked at the intelligence officer, and he told the young man he was suffering from exhaustion and needed to take a rest. The next day, the officer was gone, sent on sick leave. The photographs were filed away. The operation proceeded exactly as planned. What followed was 9 days that the British Army would spend the next 50 years trying not to talk about. To understand Arnhem, you need to understand the mood of September 1944. Paris had been liberated on August 25. The German army was in full retreat across France and Belgium. Allied commanders were euphoric. Some believed the war could be over by Christmas. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of British and Canadian forces, had a plan to make that happen. He called it Operation Market Garden. The concept was audacious, almost reckless. 3 Allied airborne divisions would drop behind German lines in the Netherlands. They would capture a series of bridges over the major rivers, the Maas, the Waal, and finally the Rhine. The last bridge was at Arnhem. Once the bridges were taken, a massive ground force, XXX Corps, would race up a single road from Belgium, cross all the bridges, and pour into Germany's industrial heartland through the back door. The war, in theory, would be over within weeks. Montgomery presented the plan to Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower had doubts. Other commanders had doubts. American General Omar Bradley called it one of Monty's gambles. Montgomery dismissed every objection. He was supremely confident. He had just driven the Germans out of France. He believed the German army was broken, that they could not mount serious resistance. There was just one problem with this belief. 2 of the most experienced SS Panzer divisions in the German army had just arrived near Arnhem to rest and refit. They had 300 tanks between them. Somebody knew this, and somebody chose not to let it change the plan. His name was Major Brian Urquhart, not to be confused with General Roy Urquhart, who commanded the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. They are different men who share a surname, which adds to the confusion of this story. Major Brian Urquhart was the intelligence officer for the entire Market Garden operation. His job was to know what the enemy was doing. In the days before the operation, Urquhart received reconnaissance photographs taken by RAF Spitfires flying over the Arnhem area. What he saw in those photographs made him reach for the telephone. Tanks, German tanks, in the forests around Arnhem. Not a few tanks, not damaged tanks being repaired. Combat-ready vehicles belonging to the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. Together, roughly 300 armored vehicles and 20,000 battle-hardened troops. Urquhart took the photographs to his commanding officer, then up the chain, to General Frederick Browning, commander of the Allied Airborne Army. He was told the photographs were inconclusive, that the tanks were probably broken down, probably just being stored, that he was being too cautious. Urquhart pushed harder. He requested the operation be modified, drop the paratroopers closer to the bridge, change the landing zones, account for the panzers. The answer was no. The landing zones couldn't be changed. Anti-aircraft fire near the bridge was too dangerous. The paratroopers would land 8 miles away and march to the bridge. 8 miles, through a city, past 2 SS Panzer divisions. When Urquhart continued to raise concerns, he was told something that has been remembered ever since. He was told that his anxiety was showing, that he was clearly fatigued, overwrought, that he needed rest before he did something to embarrass himself. The next morning, Major Brian Urquhart was gone, sent to a military doctor, placed on sick leave, removed from the operation he had been warning everyone about. The photographs stayed in the file. The operation launched on schedule. September 17, 1944. Early afternoon. The Dutch civilians of Arnhem heard the planes before they saw them, a sound like thunder that didn't stop. Then they ran into the streets and looked up, and they wept. Because falling from the sky, in every direction, were paratroopers, thousands of them, red berets catching the September sunlight. The Dutch people had been under German occupation for 4 years. They believed the paratroopers had come to free them. They came out of their houses with flowers, with food, with anything they had. The paratroopers smiled and moved on quickly. They had 8 miles to cover. The plan called for the British 1st Airborne Division to move rapidly from the landing zones to the Arnhem Road Bridge. 3 battalions would take 3 different routes through the city. Speed was everything. The entire plan depended on reaching the bridge before the Germans could organize a defense. The first problem appeared within minutes. The radios didn't work. The British Airborne had been issued radios that operated on frequencies absorbed by the pine forests of the Arnhem area. Units could not communicate with each other. Commanders could not reach their battalions. The artillery support that was supposed to clear the way couldn't be directed to the right targets. And from the forests to the north and east, the panzers were moving. The 9th SS Panzer Division, whose existence had been documented in those photographs, had responded within 2 hours of the drop. They were not broken down. They were not in storage. They were between the paratroopers and the bridge. 2 of the 3 British battalions were stopped within miles of their landing zones. 1 battalion made it through. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and 740 men reached the north end of Arnhem Bridge at 8 p.m. on September 17. They dug in. They waited for the rest of the division to arrive. They waited for 4 days. No one came. John Frost's position at the north end of Arnhem Bridge became one of the most celebrated defensive stands of the Second World War. 740 men, surrounded, no artillery, no tank support, no reinforcements. Against them, the combined weight of 2 SS Panzer divisions. They held for 4 days. The Germans sent armored columns across the bridge. Frost's men destroyed them with Piake anti-tank weapons and grenades. The wreckage of German vehicles piled up on the bridge approaches. The Germans couldn't cross, and Frost couldn't escape. Meanwhile, 8 miles west, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division was being systematically destroyed. Supply drops continued on schedule. The problem: the drop zones were now behind German lines. Day after day, RAF aircraft flew through intense anti-aircraft fire to drop ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Day after day, the supplies landed among German troops. Some RAF pilots watched through their cockpit windows as the supplies they had just risked their lives to deliver were collected by German soldiers below. They flew back to England, loaded up again, flew back the next day. The British paratroopers sent radio signals, on the few radios that worked, begging for the drop zones to be changed. The messages reached headquarters. The drop zones were not changed for 3 days. 3 days. When the change finally came, it was too late for most of the men who needed the supplies. 60 miles to the south, the armored columns of XXX Corps were supposed to be racing up a single road to relieve the paratroopers. They were moving, but not fast enough. The road was narrow, raised above the surrounding farmland on an embankment. A single knocked-out vehicle could block the entire column. The Germans knocked out many vehicles. XXX Corps had been scheduled to reach Arnhem in 2 days. By day 3, they were at Nijmegen, still 11 miles short of Arnhem. They would not reach Arnhem for 9 days. The paratroopers had supplies for 2. Back at Arnhem Bridge, Frost's men were running out of everything: ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. The buildings they were using as strongpoints were on fire. Frost himself had been wounded. He commanded from a stretcher. On the morning of September 21st, 4 days after the drop, the last defenders at Arnhem Bridge were overrun. Frost was taken prisoner. His 740 men had held the most important tactical objective in Operation Market Garden for 4 days against overwhelming odds. No one came to relieve them. With the bridge lost, with XXX Corps still unable to break through, with barely 2,500 men still capable of fighting, the order was given: withdraw. On the night of September 25th, 9 days after the drop, Operation Pegasus began. The surviving paratroopers of the British 1st Airborne Division would try to cross the Rhine River under cover of darkness. They moved in silence through the rain, no talking, no lights. If the Germans heard them, they were dead. Dutch civilians, at enormous risk to their own lives, guided the men through back gardens and along hidden paths to the riverbank. Some Dutch families hid paratroopers for weeks, knowing that if discovered they would be shot. At the river's edge, British engineers had assembled small boats. The men crossed in groups. The boats went back, came forward again. Some men swam. The Rhine in September is cold. By dawn, 2,163 men had crossed. More than 8,000 had not. 1,400 were dead. Nearly 6,500 were prisoners of war. The largest, most spectacular Allied airborne operation of the war was over. Field Marshal Montgomery's public statement after Market Garden called the operation 90% successful. 90%. He argued this because 4 of the 5 bridges in the operation had been captured. Only Arnhem had failed. But Arnhem was the entire point. The Rhine crossing was the purpose of the operation. Without it, the rest meant nothing. In his memoirs, published in 1958, Montgomery wrote that Market Garden had been a brilliant conception, and was 90% successful. He acknowledged that the final bridge had been unfortunate. He did not mention the intelligence reports. He did not mention the photographs. He did not mention Major Brian Urquhart. The official British Army report on Market Garden was classified. The intelligence failures were not made public for decades. The families of the 1,400 men who died received telegrams. None of them received an explanation for why the operation had been launched when the intelligence said it shouldn't be. Major Brian Urquhart survived the war. He went on to have a distinguished career, not in the military, but at the United Nations, where he eventually became Under-Secretary General. He outlived most of the generals who dismissed him. He outlived Montgomery, who died in 1976 still insisting Market Garden had nearly worked. In interviews late in his life, Urquhart was asked if he was angry, if he resented what had happened to him, what had happened because of him being silenced. He said he was not angry. He said he was sad, because he knew the men who died at Arnhem. He had briefed them. He had eaten with them. He had watched them board their aircraft on September 17, and he had known, from the moment the first plane disappeared into the sky, what was waiting for them. In the Dutch town of Oosterbeek, just west of Arnhem, there is a cemetery. 1,759 graves. British and Polish paratroopers. Every year, on the second Sunday of September, the people of Arnhem and Oosterbeek hold a ceremony. Dutch schoolchildren, many of them very young, each carry a small bouquet of flowers. They walk through the cemetery and place a flower on every single grave. They have done this every year since 1945. They haven't forgotten the men who were dropped and not rescued, even if the generals who sent them never truly acknowledged what went wrong. The last veterans of Arnhem have all passed now, but in Oosterbeek, the flowers keep coming, every September, without fail.